A lot of stuff out of that room, haven't they?
And then he had a storage room.
I've been so
involved with the rest of them. His whole basement was just
Yeah, I haven't either. I've noticed a lot of the things shifting around though.
This room looks great.
It does. It looks awesome. We love
In
it.
fact, it was a 3-bedroom house, had 3 bedrooms upstairs.
I don't know when they actually turned it on, but when I was coming in from the
Then
front, I
it
could hear them
As
talking.
big as this.
Oh, really?
Here. And it
Oh,
was
I like
full
your
of
shirt.
Mickey Mouse
Thank
memorabilia.
Brandon,
I mean, full.
gone for a few weeks.
It's a new me. I know.
Shelves, everything. I could not believe
Yeah.
It's a
Oh, yeah.
happy
You,
shirt.
welcome to the new
I'm
classroom.
happy to see it.
millions of dollars on those. And he traded them and sell them. Actually, I don't think he ever sold them. Maybe traded for some more. 2 for 1.
Tried to mimic the
When
our previous setting.
Yeah, we just gotta get the dishwasher installed.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
Although I guess there's like a sink and
There's a sink back there. Yeah. It's,
figure something out if we can.
The top piece weighed 1 ton.
A ton?
yeah.
Well, if you're lifting it, that's
Sink
what
and mirror. It looks like it would be a bathroom, but it's
and
not.
Because of legalities and
It's probably a good
wall,
thing.
They refuse to put the top on the
I
bottom.
But
feel like we're short of
So
bathrooms
we started
it.
There is one right here though.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, they're spread around pretty
Yeah, they are.
pretty evenly.
Oh, wow.
It's really
But
just
that took the whole floor.
just the room up. It's really primarily
Pick
the,
it, place it,
the flooring and like
anchor it
the-
behind.
yeah, they
Put the paint on that.
they painted here and
Painting
wall,
makes a
right?
difference.
Those guys
Makes
should
it brighter.
get it up the
Yeah,
stairs.
well, the floor
Oh,
makes
yeah.
a huge difference in how bright the room is.
cleaned the wood paneling. Bill took the blinds home and pressure washed them to clean them
Oh
off.
wow, yeah,
And if they
yeah,
hadn't
They did a lot in here.
given us money.
very nice.
Chris hung this bigger whiteboard behind me. There was a small one up here, but
If you want to pick it
Thought
up.
that'd be
and
useful
place
just
it,
maybe
I'll take
sometime.
liability.
Draw
Now we need to
pictures.
get you new markers.
And anchored.
yeah, we got a
I'll
couple.
take that liability, I'll sign whatever. If it's in safe, they got her money.
Nicely done.
I couldn't play that game.
Yeah, I like the floor.
What they could do with the snap together floors these days, there's all kinds of options.
Yeah, my mom and stepdad are laying some down in their kitchen. They just got new cabinets and stuff installed.
Mm-hmm.
You think this is easier than one piece of linoleum?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, getting that one piece of linoleum, like, just like you
Cut
want
it just right and then getting it situated.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you glue it down, right, with linoleum.
Yeah.
Well, I was gonna just lay it.
This stuff.
Who is a stranger we have?
This stuff just.
I don't know. I'm your new Sunday school teacher.
Somebody.
A friend of mine I worked with for 40 years had a goatee.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a goatee.
I didn't know this.
You guys have all seen me without a beard, so it's not too much of a shock. It's just,
Well,
yeah, it's been a while.
after I had
Thank
known
you.
him for like 35 years, he shaved it off.
Yeah,
His daughter took one look at him and burst out crying.
yeah.
Oh yeah, you gotta be
Yeah.
careful about that stuff.
Yeah.
Your kids have never seen you in a
My
different way.
my dad had had a beard my entire life, and then I was maybe a teenager or getting close to it, and he came over one day and he had shaved his beard off, and I hated it. It was weird for me. I was like, where'd my dad go?
Mm-hmm.
But now I've seen him go back and forth a couple times. You know, or after that, I got used to it. But he mostly still wears a beard. He just decided to shave it off that time. But
All the women of the world appreciated your shaving it off.
I don't know. Some girls. It was mostly guys that would compliment it. Sometimes girls would be like, "I like your beard," But yeah, I was
They're
just.
just
Yeah, maybe they're just being nice.
That's
Yeah.
the thing they noticed.
Yeah, but yeah, it wasn't planned or anything. It's always been the same way when I've grown my beard out. I'll just be doing who knows what, and I'll just think, I'm gonna cut my beard off, and so I just went and did it. I went right in the bathroom, cut it off without saying a word, and walked back in the living room where Kelsey and Jessica and Jessica she loves it when I shave. She hates my beard, so
Yeah.
she literally had some tears of happiness. Kelsey likes the beard, but she also, she likes me clean shaven as well, so she's more neutral. But I appreciate Jessica tolerating my, me entertaining the beard for a while.
I don't know if you've got the styrofoam cup, and I just grabbed it. Have it.
No,
I did too. I grabbed
use
the
your
cup.
ceramic cups, it's no problem.
Yeah, we do have a sink here to just, do
Clean
the
it
old
up.
swirly whirly to clean them out. And
Thought I'd get one with my name on it.
Not
Hey,
built with the
yeah.
ceramics, but the few that are, and the little bit goes on.
Okay. I was wondering.
And we'll save on recycle, or we can't recycle the cups, we'll save on the dumps.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's 10 o'clock, so we can get started. Go over the announcements real quick. There's this top one here just talks about the trustees that are cleaning up the area and then repairing some areas inside the facility. And if anybody wants to help, they can donate to facility renovations account. I know we're trying to fix some things internally amongst ourselves, and then, you know, there's larger projects being evaluated and getting estimates and things of that nature there. But any donations to the facility renovations will go towards, you know, facility renovations. So landscape team is starting to work on the front entrance. I'm supposed to be part of that team, I haven't really done anything, so I need to get out there and I need to get with Doug and confirm what I have an area of obligation, and I need to.
He'll tell you what to do.
Yeah, he'll tell me what to do. That's what I need. Just, you know, I'm a Marine. Just tell me where to go and what to do, and I'll go do that. August fellowship table is Friday at the 12th at noon. So this coming Friday in the fellowship hall. It's going to be stuffed chicken breast. So it's always noon to 1. If you want to come, anybody in town's welcome to come. $5 a ticket.
And wonderful fellowship.
And wonderful fellowship. That is
Don't
right.
get enough of that.
Everybody just praises the fellowship table experience and says it's a great thing, and I have no doubt. Saturday, not yesterday, but you know, next Saturday is our obligation at the Ecumenical Storehouse to help pick up donations. So meet there at 9. It's usually when everybody gets there and we get in the truck and take off. So from 9 to noon, we'll go pick up any donations that have been called in. And you know, Storehouse is a great ministry. It's you know, it's like it's kind of like Agape here, except it's for different things, home furniture and, you know, appliances and the things that you really just need to live comfortably in a home, beds and that sort of thing. So people are wonderful at donating, and it all gets used. So it's a great thing.
Yeah, we have a lot of plates and cups and sheets and things like that. I mean,
Oh yeah, I guess a lot of stuff probably comes into Agape that then gets transported over to Ecumenical.
A lot of
Probably.
people just donate directly to
Yeah.
Ecumenical.
Yeah.
But they have a lot of all the furnishings that you need.
They really do. Towels, blanket. I mean, really anything that you can think of you would need, they're gonna have it, or they'll point you to where, you know, like Agape would have the clothes and that sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah, between those two, it's a pretty awesome you know, thing that we have here in Oak Ridge. Other than that, we have the noisy offering coming up next Sunday.
Next Sunday.
Yes. And
Don't
so
panic yet.
what's that?
Huh?
Don't panic yet.
Don't
Yeah,
panic yet.
I looked at my,
Put your earbuds in.
yeah. Well, I don't have,
But
I
also-
don't care to change any.
I don't
Oh,
either.
yeah?
It's hard. Yeah, I've got an ashtray in my truck that I fill full of change, and so I'll try to
There you go.
dump it out and bring it in.
No, my
But-
wife usually goes to the bank and gets rolls of
Yeah, that's
coins just to be sure there's enough noisy offering to make a noise.
Yeah, it's good. I like how the noisy offering is fun. It's unique, but then it also takes that money and it's set aside for a particular, you know, ministry or something. And this year it's going to this Ukraine relief fund that CBF has going on, and so those funds will get out to people in the Ukraine or people that have been affected by that or displaced and that sort of thing.
I like it also because the kids are involved.
Right. Yeah, and it gets the kids involved here when you know they bring the cans around. The first time I saw that here when I started coming here to First Baptist, I was like, that's a really cool idea. I like that that's a thing here. And then there's a library team meeting on Monday, August the 15th at 2 p.m. And that is it for the announcements. So we'll shave my beard, Joy. she gave me a wild look. All right, so let's pray, and then we'll get into Sunday school. Lord, we just thank you so much for this, for another opportunity to gather in your name. We thank you continually for this new classroom and the reason for it, that we're able to welcome this other group of Christians into our building so that they can praise and worship you and fellowship in your name. And we just pray that you'd be with us this morning for all of our services, be in our hearts and our minds. Help us to just to meditate on you and your ways, and help us to be like Christ, and help us to learn more about you, Lord, and grow closer together through this shared thing that we do here. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So last week we started discussing that. Yeah, go ahead.
How long did it take you to grow your beard out that far?
Oh,
why can't you grow the hair? Head?
Well, I've just been shaving my head since even before I joined the military, and I just prefer it. So I actually do have some thinning spots now, but I didn't originally. But I would shave my head regardless. I just prefer it. That my beard would have been tremendously longer. I trimmed it quite a bit, but I think I had been growing it for close to 2 years. I'd have to go back and look at a picture of when it started to bloom, but I think it was just a couple of years. The first time I did it, I grew it for 3 years straight, and I'd never trimmed it, so it got down. It was like Gandalfish, but it was kind of unruly though, because if you don't trim it, it doesn't grow perfectly. But I just wanted to see what would happen. So anyway. So last week we started discussing the problem of evil, or the problem of suffering, as an argument against God's existence, and we distinguished between the intellectual problem of suffering versus the emotional problem of suffering. I'll repeat what Dr. Craig said. He says the intellectual problem of suffering lies in the province of the philosopher. So it's these things that we're thinking about and that sort of thing, kind of apart from any sort of emotional attachment to anything. While the emotional problem of suffering lies in the province of the pastoral counselor, where people who are actually struggling with this on an emotional level, they don't, intellectual answers aren't always going to be of value to someone, and vice versa. It's what the counseling you might give to someone who's struggling with suffering is not going to be of great value to the philosopher or the person who's trying to think philosophically about the problem of suffering. And then we also pointed out how there's two versions of the intellectual problem of suffering. There's the logical problem of suffering, which we discussed last week, and then there's the evidential, or the probabilistic version of the problem of suffering, which is what we're going to talk about today. And that's the more popular form of the argument that you'll run into, whether you're reading about it or talking to someone. And the evidential argument is much more modest, since it doesn't, make the claim that God and suffering are logically incompatible. If you remember, the logical argument would say that suffering and then this all-good, all-powerful God, those two things are logically incompatible. If you have one, you can't have the other. And we saw that was false. It doesn't try to say that they're incompatible. Rather, it just argues that it's highly improbable that if God, all-powerful, all-good God exists, then there would be so much suffering as we observe in the world. And so given that we do see so much suffering in the world, it's improbable that God exists, would be the claim here with the evidential argument. And so what the evidential argument is really saying is that if God is so powerful and if he's so loving and good, then it's just really improbable that he exists, given all the suffering in the world that's going on around us throughout history up to today. So the key to this argument is the claim that if God exists, he probably doesn't have good reasons for permitting the suffering and the evil that we see in the world. But so the question is that true? Is it true that God probably doesn't have, good reasons for permitting evil and suffering? So another question: are we in a good position to say that it's improbable that God, has or doesn't have good reasons for permitting suffering in the world? It seems that we're not in such a position, given how limited we are. we have cognitive limitations to be able to just think about all the events in the world and all throughout history. And we're only, each of us are only here for a short time. But just think of how limited we are in time and in space. And then compare that to God, who is sovereign over time and space and is able to providentially order things, so that his ultimate ends are achieved. So it may just be that God has good reasons for allowing a good deal of suffering in the world along the way throughout history in order to accomplish those ends that, his ends, whatever that is.
It's basically we can't see what God sees.
Right. That's a very simple way of what I just said with a lot of words. we don't have our vision, our understanding, our experience is all limited compared to God's. So what seems pointless from our, limited vantage point may be justly permitted, if we had God's wider, frame of reference. Dr. Craig gives two illustrations of this point. He gives one from contemporary science, and he gives another one from popular culture. And so I'm gonna talk about those. The first illustration that he gives is from a field of science called chaos theory. You guys have probably heard of it, and if you haven't heard of it, you have probably heard of the so-called butterfly effect, which kind of was born, which is related to chaos theory. Chaos theory and the butterfly effect are in reference to the same thing essentially, but the butterfly effect term I think is older. The term butterfly effect was coined by a meteorologist. His name was Edward Lorenz, and he was a meteorologist in the 60s. And what he did is he developed this numeric-based computer modeling system for weather patterns. And he would put in all these determining factors, and then he would let this thing run for hours and days, and that sort of thing. And what he discovered was that by altering the initial conditions of that model, just in the slightest bit, the tiniest amount, it would result in a wildly different outcome. So after he, when he would go look at the model and what it was spitting out, the numbers it was spitting out. And so he later dubbed this discovery the butterfly effect, as a kind of a poetic way of describing this phenomenon. And the idea here was that even just the small gust of wind produced by the fluttering of a butterfly's wings, something that small, something that trivial, it was an analogy for how, like I said, just the tiniest change in initial conditions of something can have wildly different outcomes, later on in the future. And so, but he actually learned that this actually informed us a lot about predicting weather patterns as well, and it's still true today. What Lorenz said, he told everyone back in the 60s that because of this, that long range weather forecasting was doomed. That it simply would never be accurate, and that's just as true today as it even 60 years later, we've had all these advances in technologies, and computer modeling has advanced wildly since then. This is when Lorenz was doing this when a computer was like a huge piece of equipment, but even now, with all that we have and all the technology we have, beyond like 2 or 3 days, even the world's best forecasts are still very speculative. And when you go out to like a week or beyond, they're pretty much worthless. I mean, it's just kind of like, when you go look at like the 10-day weather forecast, it's kind of like looking at your horoscope, right? I mean, it's just, they'll admit to that, but they try. If things were to just stay the same, then that 10-day weather forecast would be pretty accurate if they really could rely on what they're seeing now and what they saw just, in that limited view that they have. But anyway, that's kind of a the butterfly effect since then has been applied to the course of world history, and that's kind of what chaos theory talks about. And we simply can't have any way of knowing how seemingly insignificant and trivial alterations can radically affect the outcome of world events. So that's chaos theory. The second illustration that Dr. Craig gives is of a movie, and it's a really good movie that I've seen. And some of you guys, I thought it was a good movie. It's called Sliding Doors. It's got Gwyneth Paltrow in it. You know what I'm talking about? It's a really neat movie. So the movie begins with Paltrow's I don't remember her name. Paltrow's character losing her job. That's just how it starts. She loses her job, and she's leaving the building, where she worked and has been fired from. And on her way and she's headed to the subway, the train station. On her way, she drops and she loses her earring or something like that, and then it ultimately just causes her to miss her train. So she gets there right at the time the sliding doors close and the train goes on. Well, at that point of the movie, it rewinds and it replays everything over again, except this time when she's on her way to the train. So she lost her earring because there was a little girl sitting on the subway steps, and she kind of like trips over her, bumps into her, and then blah, blah, blah. So that's what stumbled her and made her miss the train. Well, the film rewinds, it replays all the events again, but this time the little girl's dad moves her out of the way in time so that Gwyneth Paltrow does not encounter the little girl. She makes it to the train just in time, and she makes it through the sliding doors, hence the name of the movie, The Sliding Doors. So based on, this, from then on, the movie just kind of continues to, it continually alternates between the two storylines, the one where she missed the train and the one where she got on the train. And so that's how the movie flows from then on. But so based on this seemingly trivial event, this little girl who's on the stairs in one storyline and it gets moved in the other storyline, the two paths of the character's life, it increasingly diverges as the movie goes on. And in the one life, she's very successful, she's very happy. And then in the other life, she experiences a lot of struggles and hardships and suffering, and just a lot of general unhappiness. And so it's all because of this one little split-second difference in getting through the sliding doors of the subway. And more than that, the determining factor, of this, whether or not this little girl's playing on the stairs or whether she's moved out of the way, that's the trivial event. That's what you're supposed to remember. But I mean, just think of how many other things would have led up to that event, even the little girl being there. So you have to wonder how many other, why was the girl there with her dad playing on the stairs that morning? Was he late for something, or could he have been late? So you could just amplify these little, trivial events. It just becomes incalculable. So, I don't want to spoil the movie for anyone. If you haven't seen it, I think it's worth watching. But suffice it to say, the happy and successful story, it doesn't end the way you expect it to. And then same thing with the life where she's struggling and generally unhappy. It also has an unexpected ending. So you can't predict things based on that either. And so that's the important point for our discussion. We're just not in a position to make probability judgments when it comes to, things like God permitting suffering in the world and that sort of thing. Whereas, like Gary pointed out, we don't see what God sees. So he has this, he's in that position to make those, to permit suffering, I guess is what I'm getting at.
I believe that God has a plan for us as humanity, an end game or a
right,
goal
yes.
that He's moving us towards. But think about the problem of free will. All these different humans with all these different choices and free will, and trying to move all of that, still giving us free will, but trying to move us towards this plan.
Yeah, free will is a big part of it because, again, we've talked about, free will allows, humans to commit and bring moral evil and moral suffering into the world. And then we've also talked about the natural evils, which are the more difficult ones because those are the ones that just seem, they just seem meaningless. Like, why did God why do we have a world where earthquakes happen or tsunamis happen? But again, we can say that, from our vantage point, it may seem, meaningless or unnecessary, but is it? Are we in a position to say so? I know one of the things that Dr. Craig said in his Sunday school was that he basically says, maybe this world and its natural inner workings, and we've talked about this too, how some of them are just beautiful. Even the devastating ones can be beautiful if you're not, caught up in it or something, or affected, harmed by it. But he basically says that the natural operations of the world and the cosmos may just be the arena. This was the arena that God designed for humans endowed with free will, for this to play out, so that we might seek Him and find Him and be saved. So there's a bunch of, you could speculate on it a lot. I think
when 9/11 happened, I was watching on television the second plane hitting the tower, and the first thing that came to mind was, God, why would you let this happen?
Yeah, I think that was
so much suffering.
Yeah.
But then, after thinking about it, God knew what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And He watched it just like we did, but He took care of it in the end.
Yeah.
And the people that He wanted to save, He saved.
Yeah.
Brought to heaven. So they did have immense suffering at that point. And some people didn't go to heaven.
Yeah.
But God knew the result of that. And like I said, He could see a broader picture than we can.
Sure. And I mean, and it's easy to, I think that was a big outcry, if where was God and that sort of thing. But then, it's easy to say, because you do get emotionally wrapped up and invested in these things, which is the right response. But, why don't we say that about, things that happened 100 years ago, tragedies and things that didn't affect us directly, at least not that we can tell. They have affected us, I'm sure, but we didn't experience them, so we're not saying, where was God, when all the people were dying in World War I. 9/11, as far as lives lost, is pretty small compared to some of the other events in history. So, but we do focus on the things that happen to us, and that's just the way that we operate. But So Craig says, given the dizzying complexity of life, we are simply in no position to judge with any sort of confidence that God has no good reason for permitting some instance of suffering to afflict our lives. Every event that occurs sends a ripple effect through history, such that God's reason for permitting it might not emerge until centuries from now, and maybe even another country. Only an all-knowing God could grasp the complexities of directing a world of free people toward His previsioned ends. Just think of the innumerable and calculable events that would be involved in arriving at a single historical event. So, it's kind of, I like the way he put it, so I just quoted him there. And he goes on to give an example, such as, try to think of all the events that came into play that led up to D-Day, World War II, 1944. When the Allied forces, invade France at the beaches of Normandy and all that stuff. Just, or you could just put in 9/11. Think of all the events that led up to that's more, closer to home.
We had a discussion in a weekend retreat talking about discovering God's will.
Yeah.
And one of the things that came out of that was that He gave us free will, and we make decisions, and we're coming up on this road that God has implied for us to follow, and then all of a sudden we make a turn because our free will turned us in another direction. Well, God has the ability to see, where are you going? I'm going to give you another opportunity to turn on the right way.
Right.
And He provides us with other opportunities to do what He wants.
And that's a good example of what we're talking about. Just think of what all does that require for Gary to make a decision here that maybe didn't line up exactly with what God wanted for him, but God still wants Gary to have all the opportunities. Just think of what it would require to make that sort of planning for everybody, not just us, but all of human history, and then all of the history, pre-human history that led up to our, being here, and that sort of. It is dizzyingly complex, as he says in that quote
He's
there.
an infinite God.
Right. Yeah. So the point is that given our, cognitive limitations, it's just impossible for us to say that probably God doesn't have reasons for permitting suffering. That's what we're getting at. We're simply just not in the position to make that statement or make that assessment. And so that'd be the first, way to respond to this evidential problem of evil, to someone who says God probably doesn't exist because, well, just look at how terrible the world is.
Yeah.
And then a second, response. But I also, the world's a really good place, and too at the same time, right? I don't want to bring us all down into the shadows of the world, because there's a lot of good things in the world too, a lot
I
of
was
light.
thinking that Gary's a perfect example. You weren't here at the time, but I remember when he left America to go and get a baby that they were adopting.
Yeah.
And he came back with 3 kids.
Not quite, but it was that. Yes, that happened.
Yeah, I vaguely remember you telling me that story.
And,
Yeah.
and how he changed the lives of those 3 kids.
Yeah.
If he had just come back with a baby,
Yeah,
the other 2 would have probably had pretty awful lives.
it's possible. Yeah. I mean, you never
and now
know.
he's got grandchildren, and
Great
maybe
grandkids.
Yeah.
great grandkids.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good example.
Well, definitely it was led. There was no doubt about it.
Well, that's what's awesome. I have those things. We probably all have those things in our lives where you're like, man, I really can't imagine like my life taking this turn, or even me deciding, even
Right.
though you do it freely. It's like, would I have done that on my own, or was there something there, guiding me? I've seen that in my own life, and I like it. So a second response is to understand that when it comes to the full scope of the evidence, when we're talking about God's existence, I think God's existence really is more probable than not. And that's kind of what we've been getting at with all this natural theology anyway. So if someone claims that God's existence is improbable, your immediate response should be, well, to ask the question, improbable, in relation to what? Why is it improbable? If all the person is considering is the probability of God's existence in relation to all the suffering in the world, and that's all they're looking at, they're just looking at that in isolation, okay, sure. It seems a little improbable that this all-powerful, all-good God is there. But, the probability of God's existence relative to the suffering in the world, taken alone in isolation, isn't really an interesting question. That's not really a good way to consider the probability of God's existence. The really interesting question would be, how probable is God's existence relative to like all the evidence that we have? Not just the bad or the suffering that's in the world taken in isolation, but all of the evidence. And again, Craig, I'm going to quote him again because I'm not quoting him, but he gives a good example of working with probabilities. This is a quotation directly from him. He says, probabilities are always relative to some background information. Probabilities are not absolute. It is always probable with respect to some background information. So, for example, suppose we are given the information that Joe is a college student and that 90% of college students drink beer. Okay? Relative to that information, it makes it highly probable that Joe, drinks beer. But now suppose you're given some additional information that Joe is a student at Wheaton College, and they've done surveys or something, and that 90% of students at Wheaton College do not drink beer. They abstain from alcohol. So now relative to this new set of information, it's completely opposite. It becomes now highly improbable that Joe is a beer drinker. So probabilities are always relative to background information, and so the more background information you have, the better probability judgment you can make. And so as we can see from that example, just a tiny little bit of additional information can quickly swing the probability of something from improbable to probable, or vice versa. So when you consider the full scope of the evidence that we have for God's existence, just think of some of the arguments we've talked about as we've gone through this natural theology. I think the probability of God's existence, for me at least, and I think these arguments, I think they outweigh the improbability of God's existence. So the improbability of God's existence relative to the suffering in the world is, again, I think outweighed by taking all of the evidence rather than just looking at that one thing in isolation, which is typically what's happening.
Well, they often turn a blind eye to the joy in life.
Well, right. That's a good point. That's what, and that's, that kind of goes with what we're saying here. It's like when you just focus on that one thing, and it's also the reason I wanted to say, I don't want us to just think about suffering in the world. There's also a lot of good in the world. So, but that's adding that extra background information. You have to think about more. You have to think about the world bigger than just the bad that's happening. If you're going to make a probability judgment about something like God's existence. So, and as we've already discussed, something to add here, we've discussed the moral argument, right? We talked about the moral argument. And that weighs in here, because if a person truly believes that suffering, is an evil thing, and that it's something that ought not be, well, as soon as you start making those sorts of statements like we shouldn't have this kind of suffering in the world, then you're making an appeal to that objective standard of like moral values and the good and that sort of thing that we talked about, which entails, if the moral argument is correct, that God exists. So while on a more superficial level, sure, evil might seem to make God's existence seem improbable, suffering, but on a more profound level, evil and suffering is actually evidence for God's existence if you're seeing those things as the way it ought not be, that there's this other standard that that we should be achieved.
It's so inconceivable to us that an infinite being would allow evil to exist, but that's just a case of where we are finite beings and we don't understand God's thinking.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, also, I think he is given free will, so he is allowed evil in a respect.
Yeah. When we just discussed that a few minutes ago. Yeah, I mean, free will wasn't, so, just talking about the moral evils and stuff that people commit, God, it seems to us that God has that free will, that God giving us free will is, an overriding factor. It's a greater good. It's such a good thing that, it's worth allowing the terrible things that people will do with goodwill. And that really gets into, we're going to talk more next week. We're going to kind of end this discussion on the problem of suffering and natural theology altogether by talking about, actually, when it comes to Christianity, the probability of it makes more sense when Christianity than just with the generic kind of bare bones theism. So we're gonna stop here for today, but next week we're gonna end this segment, and we'll talk about how we'll look at the uniqueness of Christianity, which is rooted in doctrines that actually increase the probability of suffering and evil in the world, because Christianity just assumes that there is suffering and evil, and but it has to do with the fact that there's at least several doctrines that show us that, for the first one that we'll talk about next week is that the chief kind of priority or whatever, the chief purpose in our life is not to just have a happy-go-lucky, comfortable life. It's to know God. That is the number one thing that the Bible teaches us and puts probably the most importance on is for us to know God. And with that said, from beginning to the end of the Bible, there's suffering that comes along with that. There's evil around it and that sort of thing. So it's something that people are enduring, that endure as they seek to know God and that sort of thing. But we'll talk about more about that next week. But again, next week we'll complete our discussions in this natural theology survey, and we're going to move into the doctrine of the Trinity the Sunday after that, so that ought to be a fun one. I'll explain to you the Trinity.
Hey! I've been waiting for that.
We're going to make perfect sense of it.
Yeah, I got a question.
Yeah.
Do any of these, in your readings and exploring, so they talked about this in relation to how humans and, as my understanding, all living things work, that we're only really sensitive to changes, so in that sense you can't really appreciate the good times if you don't have the bad times to compare them to, that sort of thing. So if things were always good, we would hate it.
Yeah, that's
come
actually
to hate it.
that's brought up in a lot of books and others and articles and whatnot. It talks about suffering and evil is that they will say well, how would we really know what's good without it? And they'll bring up like the light darkness analogy, and that sort of thing, huh?
Heaven sounds boring.
Yeah, they well, and people will make the argument that we would not do well in that, and now talking about getting to the point where we are reconciled completely with God and everything's kind of perfect there, they'll take you through a good explanation of why that's different. But I guess basically, and it's been a while since I've read some of these people exploring these thoughts, but yeah, they will point that out. They'll say, or they'll mainly pose it as questions, what would it be like if everything was just perfect all the time? And how would we operate? And do we maybe need to go through these times of suffering and experiencing this sort of to become the right kind of person or creature that would actually thrive in an atmosphere where everything was just perfect and there was no suffering and there was no evil and that sort of thing.
That seems kind of fundamental to our nature. So I guess then you can go ask, why are we that way?
Yeah, that's basically what a lot of them will get at with that it is fundamental to our nature, that sort of thing, and that gets into having free will and that sort of thing. I really think that the most difficult part of the problem of suffering is the natural evils in the world. The earthquakes that just kill tons of people and tsunamis and that sort of thing. But I think that's where we can really hammer down on are we in a position to make the judgment call that that's unnecessary, that God could have just left the world without those things and that would have been okay.
Rain
maybe
is
not.
the perfect example.
What is?
Rain, because it's life. It brings us fluid that we're allowed to have in our bodies.
Yeah.
It makes the flowers bloom. It makes the crops grow. It completely covers Kentucky.
Okay. So you're getting into
And then I had this thing where this man was talking about how he was in a plane and he was above the rain and he could see the rain going down on this city.
Yeah.
And he thought, well, this must be a little bit how God is. He's above this rain and looks down on it.
Yeah.
And
that's interesting too. You could be flying over something like these rains that are devastating Kentucky, and maybe people are suffering, dying below you, and then you're seeing this beautiful. From your perspective, it's it's probably pretty cool.
It is very cool.
So the world's an interesting place, and the way we look at it can just be just the smallest thing can change our perspective. And I don't know.
Well, speaking of the smallest things, the birth of a human being is so miraculous and so awe-inspiring that I can't see how people that harp on evil and the evil that people do and not recognize that miracle and say, there's God.
Yeah, and then that's a good, but then sometimes, the birth of a child takes the life of, a mother. And so
That's
there's,
true. Yes.
but that's another, I think, good example.
it does bring with it some pain.
Yeah, and there's, so, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I have kind of a knee-jerk reaction to arguments that say, like, who are we to judge, right? It seems like, that's kind of what I hear in this, like, we don't have God's perspective, so we can't judge. And I, partly I understand that argument. And like I said, I just have this knee-jerk reaction from, decades ago, I taught ethics to undergrads. And at that time, anyway, undergrads came in pretty consistently relativists. And their reaction to almost anything was, who are we to judge?
Yeah.
Like even Hitler.
Yeah.
Like, well, he thought it was okay.
Right.
So I guess it just, I just have this visceral reaction to a suggestion that, we can't judge. We should,
Yeah.
This,
Yeah, I see what you're saying there. I guess what I would say is like, so with just full on relativism, which is where, like her example is a good one. Who are we to judge Hitler for what he did? Well, that's like full on relativism that like, who are we to even say what's good and what's bad? And it almost gets into, there is no real truth. The truth is whatever you kind of make it out to be, that sort of thing. So I guess with this argument, though, this
way Haight Ashbury.
Well, we would be combining this, or building this on the idea that there is objective truth, that there is objective morally good, that this is rooted also in God, as we've talked about before. I guess that's why this kind of is at the end of the discussion. So it wouldn't And so what we're saying is, if God does exist, if this all good, all powerful God does exist, where objective moral values, the good, truth, all these things that we would say have objective value, they're rooted in God. Well, then what we're saying here is, we just can't judge the probability, of God doesn't have good reasons for allowing suffering and stuff like that. So it's not, I know what you're saying, because in a way so I guess you have to just explain it that way. You would have to, say, well, we're talking about making a probability judgment compared with our limited cognitive faculties, in contrast to this being who doesn't have these limitations. Can we make a probability of judgment that that being doesn't have good reasons for allowing the suffering and the evil in the world?
And are you allowing in there that we can judge God?
That we can judge God,
is it?
The non-Christian does.
Yeah. No. Well, I think that's what the evidential are. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I guess you could say, well, if this God is, let's just allow this God's there. I don't like him, that sort of thing, because he allows this. That would be a little bit different, I think. What we're trying to say is, is the suffering in the world and the bad we see in the world, is that incompatible with there being an all good, all loving God? And I think what we're trying to show is no. Now, that doesn't, I guess, well, I don't like a God that allows this type of suffering, even if he has good reasons for allowing it. I guess you could do that. I'm not, that'd be a different discussion, I guess. Yeah.
All right, so different
that's okay
question. Yeah. So you said something about, like, it's possible that something that happens now that seems bad or causes suffering could pay off centuries from now.
Well, not necessarily. What I would say is that just something that seems trivial now could who knows what the outcome could be. That could have a huge effect on some outcome centuries from now or in another place. I don't necessarily think it's the case. I wouldn't like to say that, something bad now might result in something good later. The only kind of way I would frame that is that the bad or the suffering that we see in the world now could just be a part of, maybe a necessary part of God accomplishing his ultimate ends, which we understand to be a good thing.
The crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. That one event has convinced billions of people to become Christians.
Yeah, so that's like an in the world example. Some terrible things led to Jesus's, death, and then that resulted in what we would think of as a good thing.
Fire is another example, I think, because forest fires, it's tragic. Mm-hmm. But without the fire, there isn't rebirth. Mm-hmm. So in his infinite wisdom, he has created this way for birth to come from death, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. And you could say, well, what was wrong with, did we need that fire? That sort of thing. But yeah, I wouldn't just want to say, though, you know, here, you know, this is